Okay, hello and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. This is Accessibility Metadata, a digital textbook superhero. So before we get started today, first, thank you for everyone who took the time to join us on this, the 10th anniversary of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. As always, we encourage questions. Please do use the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will do our best to answer those questions. We're going to be leaving some time at the end to get to as many of those as possible. And if we don't get to answers on those, we will follow up with you guys directly. Any questions you think about potentially after the webinar, feel free to send us an email at hello@redshelf.com. Microsoft captioning will be on during this webinar. And just an important note that a caption recording of the content today is going to be available on YouTube once we wrap up. First, a little bit about us. For those of you who don't know Red Shelf, we're an ed tech company focused on making education more affordable, accessible, and effective. And today, our software, our content delivery system, and e-reader serves more than 10,000 publishers, 1,500 business and campus partners, and we reach more than 1 million students. I am Elio Di Staiola. I am a communications manager here at Red Shelf. And also behind the scenes today is Steve Mendez. And what good is a presenter if you don't have a great backup singer? So thank you, Steve. And our star of today's show and our senior director and digital accessibility rock star, Aaron Lucas. Aaron, it's off to you.
Thank you, Elio, so much. And thanks, Steve. So let's quickly go over what our goals are today for this webinar. But first, I want to, again, thank everyone for taking the time for joining us for the 10th anniversary of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. We look forward to this webinar every year. It kind of kicks off our whole accessibility season. And so, it's great that you all joined us today. So what we really want to do is talk about how we can enable campus accessibility champions so that they can harness the power of metadata for their students. And in order to do that, we obviously have to learn a little bit more about metadata, right? So we're going to talk about the origin story of accessibility metadata, talk about how we can unmask that hidden world of accessibility metadata, and then a little bit of a discussion around the future of accessibility metadata, how we're going to put it out there in the universe and make it do good for all of us. So let's do a quick introduction of the League of Accessibility Champions, who can really benefit from this discussion today. So first and foremost, we have our ever faithful bookstore managers. They are the students' ally on the front lines. Our stalwart professors and faculty, they are really on the quest for the best and most accessible content. The mighty members of accessibility offices fighting for truth and justice in education. And then publishers worldwide who are using born accessible content as a beacon of hope, lighting the educational sky. So in the digital textbook universe, inaccessible content is really like kryptonite for students with accessibility needs. And those campus accessibility champions really need help to access and harness the information around their digital course materials prior to adoption, so they can make sure that they're bringing the most accessible content on their campus. And we really think the answer to that is accessibility metadata. So let's dig in a little bit to the origin story. Every good superhero needs a good origin story. So let's talk about metadata. So what is metadata? So really, metadata really just means data about data. And in this case, we talk about ebooks. It's data about the data in the book. And metadata might sound kind of, futuristic, but it's really not a new concept. Before the age of the internet, it was used by librarians to put information into card catalogs. And then in the digital age, there were standards developed around how to, move that across the internet. And that enabled companies who had digital materials to sell them and distribute them online. And they use metadata as a phone to do that. So for today's discussion, we are going to focus on born accessible EPUB metadata. And for those of you who don't know, born accessible is really just the idea that content is made accessible from the beginning, that a publisher is including accessibility into their workflow and checking for accessibility as they're going. So you'll hear us talk a lot about that with regards to EPUB. So why do we need metadata? Well, let's talk about the forms that it comes in, and that'll help you to understand why we need it. So there's a couple of different kinds of metadata. Operational core metadata are the things that enable vendors like RedShelf to sell and distribute content for publishers. So obviously we need to know the title, the ISBN, the author, the price, that sort of thing. The cover image is helpful, so that we can put it out on RedShelf and people can buy it. So there's also optional enhanced metadata, which provides additional ways to market or categorize content. So publishers can leverage this information in multiple ways, but part of enhanced metadata is biographies about the authors, multimedia items, excerpts from the book, and the hero of our story, accessibility metadata. So we talk about metadata as being hidden in plain sight because it's there, but you don't really know that it's there. Just like Clark Kent and Diana Prince are really just our superheroes, but it's really just kind of in disguise. And metadata is sort of that way as well. So us mere mortals, we can't decipher metadata simply by reading the book, unless of course the book's about metadata. Raw metadata is generally intended for computers to talk to each other. So again, that idea of sending the information over from one computer to another so that they can talk to each other about the book. So metadata is delivered primarily in two different methods. So publishers provide data and deliver it via an international book information format called ONIX, which, by the way, is also a very superhero-y word. It's also hidden inside the code of an EPUB. So, you have to have some method to take it out of this ONIX feed, out of the EPUB itself, in order to expose it to the customer. So how do we reveal it? Well, if we just revealed raw metadata tags, people would be like, what is this? This doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. There's a few of us who might know what access mode sufficient means or accessibility hazard. But if we're going to use this metadata as a power for good, we need to make sure that everyone can use it, that it's super user friendly. And unless you're like super geeky coder, you might not know what this means. So these metadata tags need to be transformed into something that's universally readable and understandable. And then also we want to make sure that regardless of the platform that you're going to purchase your digital materials or adopt digital materials, that it's consistently displayed across those platforms so that you're finding the same information about that title no matter where you're going. So I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh gosh, I'm going to need a secret decoder ring for this. I don't know how to figure out what this metadata means. Well, we have the answer for that too. So a bunch of industry giants, accessibility conscious publishers like Macmillan, Daisy, BISG, and Benetech, along with e-reader platforms like RedShelf, got together and decided, okay, we need to make sure that everyone can access this information in the same way. And then we're not just putting the metadata tags out into the world for people to decipher on their own. So they organized a W3C community group, which established a standard for displaying this metadata to the world. So really, this means that metadata can just be unleashed, right? There's a standard, it's categorized, and it's displayed as follows. So screen reader friendly. Obviously, that means it's screen reader friendly. So it may say, yes, this is screen reader friendly. No, it's not. Full audio. Full audio literally means audio book. And it doesn't just mean like text to speech is available. So if there is an audio book version of this title, then the answer to this would be yes. And then the accessibility summary gives you a little bit more information about the accessibility of the book. maybe some tips on what you need to do with your assistive technology to make the book work most effectively for you. And then if the book meets a specific WCAG conformance, you will see that here in accessibility conformance. Also, there's a big push right now for publishers to certify their publishing workflow for accessibility, sort of that end-to-end, from the beginning to end. We are creating digital content in such a way that it truly is born accessible. And there are companies like Benetech, for example, who can certify a workflow, sort of like a third party. It's kind of similar in a way to a VPAT, if you know what those are. So they can certify the workflow. They can say that this publisher is following all of these steps along the way to make sure their titles are accessible. And then if they get this designation, they can display this within the content to say, hey, you know, this is our credential. We have certified that this publisher is in the case of Benetech, globally certified accessible. So then if there is a report that goes along with that title, the a publisher can choose to show the report, a link to the report, which typically goes back to the certifier's website. Then if there are any specific accessibility hazards within the title, those would be displayed as well. And then if you're super geeky and you really just want to look at all the metadata tags, you can typically in a platform, there's an option to just go and look at all the tags. And, you know, we try to categorize those together, but in some cases, it's literally just the metadata tags. And you can take a look at all of the metadata that's been included by the publisher. So metadata is really a super powerful thing, right? So here, if you look at a title that's on RedShelf, you can see when you're looking at the accessibility tab that this particular Macmillan title is screen reader friendly. It has that accessibility summary, and there's some notes in there about some things you should do with your assistive technologies. It is WCAG AA conformant. It is certified by Benetech, and there again, there's their badging and their credentials and the link to their report. And then again, if you want to see all of the accessibility metadata, you just pop that window open and there you go. There's all the metadata, just to your heart's content. You can read metadata all day long. So of course, you know, not every title has metadata, right? You know, it's really just a matter of knowing which titles have metadata right now. That's kind of how we're handling it. So, you know, you may come across titles where there's no accessibility metadata available. And in that case, we've asked Oliver to let you know that right now there's no accessibility metadata. So with great power comes great responsibility. Obviously, accessibility metadata is a very powerful thing. And I'd love it if somebody put in the chat who actually said this, which superhero said this quote. But we really need to talk about now, what do we do with this metadata? How do we use it for good? How do we make sure that it gets into the right hands? So again, that whole idea of certification and publishers getting on board with certifying their workflow. There are numbers of different companies that certify that. They're the folks that also work alongside them that do their digital transformations. Some publishers don't do it on their own. Those vendors can be certified as well. You know, and it's always nice. You see that bat signal in the sky. If you see that badge within a title that says this is certified and they're proclaiming that to the world, you know, that's a really great thing for a publisher to be able to say, hey, look, we're certified. And then that means that those publishers are also focused on creating more accessible new titles and retrofitting their most used backlist titles. And I know, especially with DSOs, there is concern about, you know, what is happening in the future with publishers and accessibility. So now this is a really great way for publishers to say, yes, we know this is important. We want to make sure that our textbooks are accessible for everyone. And, you know, this is really them saying to the world, we are doing this, and here it is. So some publishers that you may recognize that are certified, these folks are certified by Benetech. And this is publishers that you recognize in the higher ed space. So obviously Macmillan, Kogan Page, Jones and Bartlett, Guilford Press, University of Michigan Press as well. And then I asked Benetech to tell me, do you have any other publishers who are kind of in that pipeline that you think folks would be interested in hearing today? And that's McGraw-Hill, Wiley, Simon & Schuster. So all pretty standard names in higher ed. So it really is gaining a lot of momentum in the publishing community. So we view this as a mission critical thing. I have declared 2021 at Red Shelf the age of metadata. So we currently have roughly 80% of our catalog is EPUB. Not all titles contain accessibility metadata. And so in order to figure out which do and which don't, we have to basically go on a mining expedition this summer. We are going to start reprocessing our existing catalog of EPUBs to surface and display not only ONIX metadata, but EPUB metadata as well. So if we find that there are titles that we have either been told by the publishers that have metadata, or through some other means we know that there should be metadata in a title, but we don't have it, then our publishing team will get together and talk to the publishers and request new files, which then go through that whole process of being sent over to us, and then we can process them and expose all of that metadata. We're also working with those certifying authorities like Benetech to create a library of certified titles within Red Shelf. So that'll kind of be a bit of a one-stop shop where you can just say, oh, I want to see all the things that have metadata. So exposing metadata really isn't enough, though. We need to go that extra mile. That's where it really, really kicks in and really gets powerful. So on our partner dashboard, this is where our publishers live and breathe at Red Shelf, we can alert our partners if we're not finding accessibility metadata where we think it should be. Also, if there's a flag that says, hey, we're expecting to see some kind of accessibility metadata here because you are doing a born accessible EPUB, it's not there, that's just more of a reason for them to potentially maybe look at their workflow and are we really including all of the things that we should be to expose the accessibility of the content that we're building. So adoption and campus tools. We're looking to flag materials that contain specific accessibility metadata and potentially providing a view inside of the world of adoptions for disability services offices. So they can see, okay, here's a list of things being adopted next term. I can see that this title is screen reader friendly, this title has this title has that, which, you know, I know that for a lot of DSOs that I've talked to, thanks to the pandemic, unfortunately, have been kind of downsized. So any help that they can get to identify maybe where they might need to assist a student, or they might need to get an accommodation, or knowing in advance whether it's going to be screen reader friendly for a student without maybe having to sample it, it's just fabulous information for them to have, makes their job so much easier. And then in our e-commerce side and campus white labels, and those two sites work together, we're looking to add an accessibility metadata search option. So if you're searching for a biology book and you want to know which one has accessibility metadata, information about accessibility, you can just simply say, yes, I want you to search for which titles have this. So I know that you're all just dying to dig into more information about metadata. You're just going to totally go crazy and learn everything you can about metadata. So we put together a list of helpful resources. Of course, when we share these files out to this file out to you, you'll be able to click on the links. But that W3C guide for metadata display is prominent on this list because it's really near and dear to my heart. But we also have included some more W3C information about web schemas and accessibility. And then, of course, the idea of ebooks for everyone with regards to accessibility metadata, how DAISY evaluates metadata, and that Benetech Global Certified Accessible. Then Macmillan has a fantastic story about accessibility. They're probably the most accessibility forward publisher. So it's really great to learn about how they got from point A to point B. And I know a lot of publishers, may follow their lead. BISG, for those publishers who've joined us today, they have a metadata workshop coming up in June. So here's the link to that if you are interested in attending that workshop. And then just a little bit more about basic digital publishing metadata in general. And then if you're really dying to know how Onyx works, there's a link for that as well. So I hope that that answers all you never thought you wanted to know about metadata. And I hope that you are submitting questions in the Q&A feature to Elio and Steve. So if we have any of those, I'd be happy to answer questions at this time.
Sure. Hey, Aaron, got a question about EPUB versus PDF with accessibility. And can you talk a little bit about the differences between those two for the benefits of the folks here?
Sure. So in terms of EPUB, that whole idea of born accessible, means that the intention of creating an EPUB is around accessibility. And so, PDFs tend to have a lot of barriers when it comes to things like, screen readers and images not being described appropriately. And while there are a lot of things that we can do to manipulate PDFs to make them more accessible, EPUB is always going to be the more accessible option. Of course, publishers are still using PDFs as accommodations. A lot of that has to do with some of the ways that students ingest into other tools to use them to learn. But really, EPUB is the wave of the future. I know that I had mentioned we have about 80% EPUB in our catalog, but 4 years ago when I started at Red Shelf, that number was flip-flopped. I think we only had about 30% EPUB. So it's definitely something that is here to stay.
Okay, and this is on a lighter note. Aaron, you charged our audience here with a question and a quote, and
Yes.
We have some very, very wise superhero fans here.
Did they get it right?
They got it right, and they took it to a new level. It was not only in Spider-Man, but it was Ben Parker, Peter Parker's uncle.
Nice. Excellent. Yeah, if you don't know me, if some of you who do know me know that I'm all about the theme. So I love to carry a theme through a presentation.
Okay, one more here, Aaron, and that's, you mentioned VPAT, and just a question and follow-up on a little explanation.
Oh yeah, VPAT, so Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. So that is essentially documentation around the accessibility of so like, for example, the Red Shelf e-reader. The Red Shelf e-reader has a VPAT, and in our case, as in the case for most folks dealing in the higher ed space, our VPAT is what's called third party. So what that means is that we work with a consultancy, Level Access, who is a third party, unbiased, assessing our technology, doing an audit on our technology to determine whether or not there are any accessibility barriers. Does it meet certain WCAG compliance? And then they turn around and turn that audit into the document, which is the VPAT. And so we're lucky enough to have a long-term relationship with Level Access. And so, we also rely on them for some other things when we're making changes to our technology and maybe want to have some of our interactions vetted by people with disabilities. Then we can, work with them to make sure that that happens. But yeah, it's really just a way for folks to know, is this technology accessible? Is it not accessible?
Great. And I think you might have glanced over this, but just to reiterate, I have a question here. Are EPUBs significantly more accessible than PDFs?
Yes, absolutely. Hands down.
Great. And another one here on VPAT follow-up. So are VPATs on the e-reader and not the ebook, or both?
There were some publishers for a while attempting to get VPATs on their books, which I think has really turned more into the idea of certifying that workflow and making sure the workflow has a certification by a third party. So that's the way in which it's similar. But honestly, VPATs are not cheap. If you've ever had to get a VPAT, you know that they're expensive. So having to do that for every single book would be prohibitively expensive for a publisher. So that's why I think the certified accessible folks who are doing that certified accessible stuff is fantastic, right? Because it really is, and it's not nowhere near as expensive as a VPAT. And once the workflow itself is certified, and there's different levels and different ways of doing that, then you can guarantee that if you're following the steps that have been validated, then you're creating accessible content every time. So it's really just more bang for your buck.
Great, and I think you might have answered the first half to this question, but I'll read both. Are these accessibility meta tags available in EPUB files? And then is there a list of standard tags?
Sure. So yes, if a publisher has included this metadata, and there's other kinds of metadata too, not just accessibility metadata. If they've included it in the EPUB, then yes, you should find it within the code of the EPUB itself. And then what we do is combine that with what comes across in that Onyx feed, which is some of it is similar and some of it is different. And publishers, some of them send it both ways. Some of them send it one way or another way. They send it like either via the EPUB itself or via the Onyx feed. But we try to consolidate all of that together. Was there a second part of that question now that I've rambled on about?
No, I think you tackled those, but a VPAT question that I'm not sure you have an answer to, but any idea on the average price of a VPAT for an EPUB?
You know what, honestly, I don't know what it would for an actual VPAT on an EPUB. I mean, my knowledge of VPATs is really based on having an entire system evaluated. So I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, but
well, we have an attendee, Julia, who is saying $2,000. So
okay, so there you go.
A rough estimate. Thank you, Julia, for that.
Yay.
All right, let's see if we've got one or two others. Okay, a top complaint from instructors are the pagination differences between the print and ebook version.
Yeah.
Some advice how I can better help both students and instructors navigate those differences.
Yeah, so there is a thing now that everyone knows that is an issue, right? You want to have a 1-for-1. So like, for instance, what Red Shelf does is we literally add the physical page number into the book itself in the reader, but there's also a metadata tag that will tell you whether or not it has parity with the book in terms of the actual page numbers. So there is that is a thing, and a lot of publishers are, because of that reason, making sure that they are having that parity there.
Okay, here's a good one from the student perspective. So is there an FAQ or resource for the student on how they can access potentially the metadata independently so they can better make decisions and advocate for their own DSO needs?
If you actually have the EPUB file and you know what you're looking for, you can dig into it that way. Basically, any resource that talks about creating a born accessible EPUB will talk about metadata and tell you where to find it. So if you dig into those links, or you just start, searching on how to create an EPUB or born accessible EPUB, you'll get tons of information back on how that works. And if you would like to talk to people who do this for a living, drop us a line and let us know, and we'll connect you with some folks.
We probably have time here for one more. And few folks asking for the number of publishers currently using accessibility metadata. I'm not sure if there's an exact number out there.
There probably isn't an exact number, but I mean, just the numbers are becoming larger and larger and larger, as time goes on. Once that whole idea of everybody should display it the same way really got cooking, that really just kind of enabled people to do it effectively and not just kind of, add metadata and then have nothing happen. But I think you're going to see a lot of publishers, there's so much focus on accessibility of content right now. I think COVID also put that, took that off the back burner a little bit. So I don't have exact numbers, but there's a lot of them, which is why I wanted to share some of the larger ones. And, typically you think it, it starts kind of at the top and then everybody kind of gets on board, but you'd be surprised at the number of small publishers who are focusing on EPUBs and who could now include metadata in their titles.
Okay, and I think I have one last one, and it's more of an ad from one of our participants today, and that VPAT is being replaced by ACR. And can you talk to that? It's Accessibility Conformance Report.
Yeah, well, the Accessibility Conformance Report is actually part of the VPAT. So it's literally just an easy to read, I guess, kind of condensed version of the VPAT. So it's essentially telling you how it was tested, what potential barriers that they found, things like that. So for someone who doesn't want to or doesn't need to dig into the meat of the VPAT, which is all the WCAG rules and all of the different conformance levels and all of that, that's what the ACR is designed to do. So let's say, for instance, we were competing for some RFP, trying to get on some campus. And obviously we have to go through a review and a demo and all of that stuff. So the ACR would be super handy for those folks, like maybe administration level folks who don't want to dig into all the details, to set for them to see, hey, this is how this technology is accessible. Then they rely on other people in that food chain, right? Like the DSOs and the IT departments to, do the demos and that sort of thing, with Red Shelf and on their own for that matter. So yeah, the ACR is a great thing, because I know VPATs can be very confusing.
Great. I think that wraps up the Q&A and the dashboard for now. And I do still want to encourage anyone who was with us today to send questions as they think of them. We'd be happy to follow up with you guys later. Erin?
For sure. Yeah. And thanks again, everybody, for celebrating Global Accessibility Awareness Day with us today. I hope you learned a little bit more about metadata and you're as jazzed about it as we are. Okay, maybe not as much as me, but hopefully you're excited. And of course, thanks to Elio and Steve for supporting me and listening to me read these slides every day this week. So hope everybody has a great rest of your week.
Thanks. Enjoy the day, everyone.
Bye.